Hello, Fuel Milwaukee. Come on in. Come on in. So today we are talking about implicit bias, unconscious beliefs that we hold and how they fuel racial prejudice, how it affects our worlds and our systems. And the good news is that although we all have these unconscious biases, we can change them. We can disrupt the patterns and disrupt problematic thinking. And this is just a very exciting conversation for all of us to have today. If you don't know who I am, I'm Corey Jo Bitto. I'm the executive director of Fuel Milwaukee. If you've been on our Fuel webinars before, you know I always encourage you to get comfortable in the space. So we have a Q&A section available for you. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask privately and have us elevate to the panel, go to the Q&A and send me those questions. The panelists that can see it will go in there and respond to you in the Q&A too if you don't want it on air. If you want to interact with other folks in the panel, go into the chat. The chat for me, besides the actual conversation, has become my favorite part. Like after the fact, I have to print it out and read it, but I'm really enjoying watching you all interact. What I learned the last webinar is that the chat function is defaulted for your comment to come straight to the panel, but you can change the default for the comment to go to the panel and all of the other participants. So if you want to get that full chat going, not just with the panelists, but everybody else that's participating, make sure you change that default, okay? So let's test it out now. Let's test out the chat. Go into the chat right now and leave us all a comment and tell us what you were looking forward to in this conversation, why this particular discussion was of interest to you, and what you're hoping to learn, okay? I see the chat. I see the chats coming through. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. All right, I'm going to introduce to you now our amazing panel of experts who are going to share a lot of information about implicit bias, what it looks like, how it works, and how we can stop it. But they also have expertise in different realms of education and workplaces and just life in general, where we'll talk about how implicit bias affects us in all of the ways that we operate, we interact with each other in our society, in our communities. First up, we have Cheryl Lucas DeBerry. Hi, Cheryl.
Hello, Corey Jo.
Cheryl is the Learning and Development Manager for MRA, and I'm going to give her a little chance to talk a little bit about MRA and the services they provide. Cheryl actually provided unconscious bias training for the MMAC, which is the parent company for Fuel, and we've worked with Cheryl before for Professional Development Bootcamp, where she's come to and talk to us about a couple of different things. So we're really glad to have her on this call. Dr. Lynn Worley. Hi, Dr. Worley.
Hi.
Some of you who are on the Unlearning Racism conversation will remember Dr. Worley, as she was a part of that discussion and is the director of the Master of Sustainable Peace Building program through UWM. I met her when she was teaching sociology at Mount Mary, where I graduated from, and she was my professor in one of my favorite classes. So thanks again, Dr. Worley, for coming back and joining us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Then I made a new friend, Mycie. Hi, Mycie. She's only been in Milwaukee for 7 months, and she's been locked up for 4 of it. Mycie is the executive director of the Hmong, Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce. How you doing, My?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, really good. So glad to have you be a part of this discussion. So I'm gonna quickly ask all of you to kind of go around and talk a little bit about the work that you do, your affiliations, and how it relates to our topic today of implicit bias. I'm going to start with Cheryl, and then let's go to Mycie, and then Dr. Worley. How about that?
Okay. All right. And thank you, Corey Jo, for inviting me, and thank you all for being on this very important webinar. This is a very important topic, as we all know, and especially now more than ever. And currently I am a Learning and Development Manager at MRA, and what we are is an employer association, so employers will join our association, and we provide human resources services. So anything that has to do with the human resources of your company, we can help you with, from being your HR support, internally, externally. We have a 24-hour HR hotline. We do all kinds of surveys and affirmative action plans and all kinds of things. So anything that has to do with HR, we can help you with. We've been in business for 119 years. I haven't been here quite that long. I know I would look good, wouldn't I? I have been at MRA for 20 years. And so unconscious bias is one of the classes that I teach, which is how I got a chance to meet Corey Joe and among many other opportunities that we've had to connect with Fuel Milwaukee. And I also teach in our leadership series and do customer service training and all kinds of things. So happy to be here today and to share with this awesome panel.
Yay,
So,
thank you. Micey?
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm just, again, I too thank Corey Joe for having me here. And this is my first time on the show. So, I certainly appreciate that. I'm really excited to be here and a part of this. So I'm the executive director over at the Hmong, Wisconsin Chamber of Commerce. And as was said earlier, I've been here 7 months. And but prior to this, I was a university professor at UW-Stevens Point in education. My background is in educational psychology, and so it's also in learning and development. I was also, prior to being an education professor at UW-Stevens Point, I was a classroom teacher, an elementary teacher in the Indianapolis Public School District. So I did that and then came back, like I said, to Wisconsin and took my position at the university. Yay, go Pointers, yes, someone says. So I spent much of my time there, and then my family moved to Kansas City for some time, for 2 years, and then this position became open, and I came back to Wisconsin. So, I've done some trainings with corporations, some nonprofits, as well as for-profit organizations, some, higher ed institutions on issues of diversity and inclusion, implicit bias included in that, some cultural competency work in the past. And so this is something that's very near and dear to me. And so I'm just, I'm happy to be here.
Glad to have you. Dr. Orley?
Sure. You did a little introduction for me already, so I'll try to keep it brief so we can jump in with both feet. I moved to Milwaukee 16 years ago, knowing basically nothing about the city. Already doing a lot of work at that time, looking at social change and social movements and how do we strategically change injustice, situations of injustice towards situations of more justice. And of course, living in the Milwaukee region took my work step by step closer and closer to a real focus on hypersegregation and racism, and particularly how we do strategic, structural, long-term, sustainable change. I also, 11 years ago, got my second child came into our family through adoption, and he's African American, and I'm now parenting 2 children who are African American, along with a child who is white. So it makes for a very interesting household study itself on the dynamics of race and racism in our society. And that led me to some community work because we had purchased a home, both of us, my husband and I, from outside of the area. We didn't know all about hypersegregation, so we fell in love with a piece of property that's in Wauwatosa, and we talked a lot about leaving Wauwatosa because of the racism, and then we realized that it was better to stay put and try to make some change. So 4 years ago, I co-founded an organization called TOSA Together, and the last few years have been very busy with that work, but particularly the last month has been incredibly busy with that work, looking to push real structural change into the community that I live in.
Thank you. Thanks. What a great panel. So let's jump right into it. I wanted to have this conversation about implicit bias for 2 reasons. One, because all of us struggle with it. All of us have these biases, right? And it's something that unless you learn about it or someone brings it to your attention, you don't really realize that you're doing it. I mean, I remember learning about like Prejudice in like the 3rd grade, but unless you take classes in college or you just continue to learn deliberately, it's not something that's constantly being put in front of people's faces. It's not something we're constantly being made aware of. And the other reason why I thought it was interesting to have this conversation is because the more we're starting to talk about it in workplaces and D&I conversations, I've noticed that even though it's not really our fault that we have unconscious bias, a lot of people are very resistant to accepting that we all do. And I've seen people kind of deny it a few times, and I'm like, it kind of makes sense that we would. And I thought, okay, well, let's just have a conversation about it, because maybe there's some fear around what it would mean to admit it or talk about it. And so that's why we're having the conversation today. Dr. Worley, I'm going to start with you and have you kind of give us your general working definition of unconscious bias, implicit bias. Are they the same? How is it different? Sort of what does that mean?
I actually like the term unconscious bias a little bit more, even though this is called implicit, because I think that it points to the dynamic that we have conscious and unconscious bias going on when we're looking at systems of racial or any kind of injustice. You're absolutely right. It can be anything, but it's basically the unconscious bias is all that work that's going on in our brains, and it's put there through experience, through the people who are important to us, through the culture, the desire to belong and be part of a group. It's put there through all of that, but we're often not aware that that's operating in our decision making, in our thinking, in our actions, and it's often, to find it is often that sort of go back and look over, sort of replay the tape of what just happened, and you go, oh, okay, and that's that unconscious bias piece that doesn't stand out. But you're absolutely right. I would agree. We all have it, and we have it towards lots of different issues of perhaps injustice. But you combine that with the concept of power, and it becomes a really important idea to understand and make sense of.
How about you, Cheryl? When you're teaching these classes, are you specifically going into workplaces, and is there a different context with which you bring the definitions and ideas around it in workplaces?
Yeah, we do talk about that whole, we have actually people come up with their own definition of unconscious bias, and then we give them kind of the textbook definition. But really what it is that we have at least 11 trillion kind of things coming at us into our brain at one time. And so the brain is wired to kind of filter out things that we don't have to necessarily think about, like breathing and blinking our eyes. And then it helps us to focus on things that are more important for us to think about, whether we're in a dangerous situation or not. And where the unconscious bias comes in is that based on our own backgrounds and experiences, that would lead us to think about a certain person or a certain group of people in a certain way. And until our conscious brain kicks in, because one of the things we do is show pictures and ask people to identify whether you think the person is competent or not competent. And I've gotten pushback with people saying, well, Cheryl, I can't identify that, or I can't say that just by looking at a picture. I'm like, yes, you can, because you do it every day. We see people walking down the street and we immediately create a story in our head about who that person is and what they do and how they do it. Driving down the street, what kind of cars they drive. If the person is Black and they're driving a Mercedes Benz, oh, are they a drug dealer? When in fact, they may be a Wall Street banker. We don't know. So that's where that unconscious bias comes into play based on our own experiences. And until our conscious brain kicks in, where we need to ask more questions, is where I think where we lose sight of the issue. So if we stop and really start to just ask more questions from a curious standpoint, then I think we can actually broaden our horizons and learn a whole lot more from each other, because we really are more similar than we are different.
Mm-hmm. Mycie, in your world, when you are talking about unconscious bias, especially in the higher education or learning environment, why is it important, or like what's the context under which it even becomes a topic of conversation in schools?
I find from my experience working with soon-to-be teachers, let's just say, we tend to say, well, I'm unbiased. A lot of students will come to me and say, I'm neutral. I'm going to approach these students in a neutral way. I'm going to treat everyone, quote unquote, the same. I'm not going to be biased. And what I often start my class with is saying, nothing is neutral. There's always a bias. We all have biases. Now, the question is, can we detect it when we have the bias? What does that look like? Do we do something about it? And I know that we're going to get to some of those questions and answers to some of those questions, at least the ones that we can answer. And, and I think in our natural brains, I know, both, Cheryl, Dr. Worley have both mentioned that, we have, we take it all in, we process the information. I'll also add that, that we have a need to make sense of information. Our brains work that way. I created two, this is going to be bringing me back to my elementary years, teaching, I should say, elementary students at the university. But our minds, when we see lots of information, we have a need. It looks like this. It might seem chaotic to us. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And what does our mind automatically do? We try desperately to try to make sense of what's in front of us, what's being presented to us. And we get frustrated when we can't make any sense out of it. So we're desperately trying to make sense to hopefully put it into folders in our minds that look like this. Okay. So this is just an example. And then, of course, in this cabinet, I'm going to call this a folder, there's all of these, right? So this is race. Then we start putting folders in there, white, black, Asian, indigenous, Latinx, right? So then we start having that to try to make sense of information. And as we bring information in, and then obviously, hopefully we can store that information and bring it back out later on. Now, just really quickly, things come out in classrooms. We talked about education. How does unconscious bias, come out in classrooms and in education in general? Some students and employees, we might look at particular students. I'll stick to the students. We might look at particular students a little bit more. Maybe because one, we think they know all the answers, or we think they're the troublemakers. So we keep looking at them, thinking that they're gonna behave a particular sort of way, when in fact, perhaps some of that, for lack of a better word, the undesirable behavior is actually happening somewhere else. They're just not making any noise. And so those unconscious biases come into play, most certainly in the educational environment also.
Let me show my screen, because I actually, when I was preparing for this, I found, there's so much information about this out here, but I found all of these different studies about schools where they have this tracking and like who the teachers are looking at, just who they're like paying attention to who they think are going to be the bad kids. And they're most often kind of looking at the Black boys, just assuming that they're going to be the naughty ones in class. And the studies go on and on. I was just overwhelmed with a lot of the information. So I have a couple of, I've learned well from you, and as the panelists can tell, we have true teachers in our midst today. Already, you guys can tell. So I have found some really, really short videos that Cheryl kind of mimic some of the videos that you show when you did the unconscious bias here at MNAC. So I'm going to show some of these because I think they help level set and bring everybody.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
Okay, so that kind of illuminated the overall ideas that you all expressed. And I think it's really interesting and important that we underpin. I mean, a lot of these conversations that we've been having have been about race because of what's going on in our world today. But unconscious bias isn't just about race, is it, Dr. Worley? What is it? Where can this crop up in people's lives? In every area?
Pretty much every area that we use for identity formation. So, you know, we want to belong. That's sort of a basic human desire and need. We tend to, as was said earlier, simplify the world to be more manageable by thinking in terms of groups. I wanted to just throw out the term confirmation bias too, because I think this is an important aspect of understanding why unconscious or implicit bias is not a neutral experience. Because what happens is over time, we make those shortcuts that Cheryl mentioned. Those shortcuts mean that instead of going through the processes of saying, I see this person and now I have to get this information or this information, we actually go back to what we already believe and we fit that person into it. And so we only see the parts of that experience, that action, that person or whatever that confirms what we had already believed about. And that's where unconscious bias gets really, really dangerous and really tricky because it becomes the basis for the action and the way that we understand. So like, you know, the stereotypes aren't just sort of standalone things. Stereotypes lead us down our path to a lot of choices that we make each and every day. And what we often do is shortcut so short that we don't allow people to stand outside of those stereotypes. We don't allow people we don't find out more about them. So we assume that we already know enough to make all the choices without even taking the time to figure out if they fit our model or not. It's like another image would be like the iceberg, that a lot of people use that, where a lot of what we think about, what goes around us in the world is really under the water, but we operate with that little piece that sticks up above the water.
Dr. Worley, if I could just add too, it's not just even just that you're absolutely right. You know, when then we seek out information or only pay attention to information that confirms the bias that we already have, and then actually ignore those any sort of evidence that might actually come in that says, but, right? But that's not important. We're paying attention only to those things that confirm our current knowledge.
And I would like to add to that too, because watching that video, and in addition to what Dr. Worley and Micey just said, it's all about the self-fulfilling prophecy, your expectations, your expectations that you have of a person, then based on what their actions are, that gives you the results that reinforces your expectations. So, you know, with the teacher in that, news clip that you had, Carrie Jo, if they automatically are assuming that the young Black boys are going to be mischievous and being disruptive, then that's what they're going to notice. They're not going to notice them not being disruptive because that's not their expectation. And that's where the unconscious bias comes into play. Whatever our expectations are, we tend to then look for those things, and then it confirms what our biases actually are and say, see, I told you. But if we're not looking for anything anything different, then we don't see anything different. It's like the old adage that goes, if all you have is a hammer, then the only thing you're going to see is a nail.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Worley, there's some comments that if you can move your mic just a little bit, because you're getting a little feedback off of just the movie. Okay, so this is something else that I saw in the chat. So let's talk about what makes this unconscious, right? So is this, because there's some question about whether or not people are, if you're making the decision to associate people with certain characteristics or whatever it might be, is this, I'm not understanding, is that what makes this unconscious is that it's like a knee-jerk reaction. It happens in seconds. It's just associations that you have rather than sitting there and pondering and then coming to a conclusion. Can you all touch on that just a little bit? What makes it unconscious? What makes it like you don't even know that you're doing it? Like how do people not know that they're doing it?
I guess, I saw that question, and one person I thought said very interestingly and maybe appropriately that it's not really unconscious then, is it?
Mm-hmm.
If we could identify that it's happening, and I guess we could maybe look at the idea that it's just the pace at which it happens and the ways that habits are really forming, so that we don't really, so yes, if people want to talk about what do you do about it, people who are specialists on this will say, well, you have to start, doing that process of the unlearning, the slowing down, the looking in the mirror, whatever you want to call it, with each situation. But I guess what we've been trying to emphasize is that it happens so fast and the shortcuts are so ingrained in us that you can find many examples where people who've worked on this for years will still say, even though I know all this, I still had this thought that was based on that bias that I was raised with.
Mm-hmm. Cheryl, when you're going into workplaces, obviously unconscious bias shows up in not just related to race, but gender, weight, religion, education, whatever it might be. What is usually the reason why companies are reaching out to you? Is there a specific thing that they're trying to tackle?
Oftentimes it is because something has happened. There's been an incident where somebody felt disrespected, somebody felt that they weren't given the promotion that they wanted, or just people don't know how to have a conversation. You're asking me, and I'll just use my race. So Cheryl, what do Black people think about blah, blah, blah? Well, I don't speak for the entire Black race. Why are you just asking me that? So I think it really is companies are trying to figure out, how do we have the conversation? What are some tools that you can give us to have those conversations? Because, I was talking to a friend of mine just yesterday, and she's African American. She lives in a rural area because she says she grew up in St. Louis. And so when she moved to Wisconsin, she really wanted to live in a rural area because their houses were so close together. And I go, whoa, I would have never expected that. But I grew up in a rural area, and that was when I moved to Wisconsin, that was the furthest thing I wanted to do, was have a garden and grow vegetables and do all those kinds of things. So I think a lot of it has to do with our own backgrounds and experiences, and so that unconscious piece is always there. It's what we do with it. We have to make that conscious decision. How do I act upon this? Should I act on it, or should I stop and maybe ask a question? I'll give you a perfect example. I was in the parking lot in Pewaukee last week of Office Depot. I had lunch, and I need to run in here and grab something. I got out of my car. I saw an African-American man in the parking lot. He was walking towards me. He had on a red shirt that told me that he worked there. That's all. Okay. He said hi, I said hi, and we kept going. I went into the store. I saw him come in and head to back area where employees usually go. Okay, so I'm looking for whatever, and then eventually he comes over to me. He said, are you looking for something in particular? And I told him what I was looking for. So he walked me around the store. Now I'm thinking, okay, he's an employee here. That's great. Thank you for your customer service. And then he said to me, my name is Leon. I'm the GM if you need any help. Wow.
Yeah.
So my unconsciousness just said he was an employee. I didn't treat him any differently because he was an employee, but it never came to my consciousness that he could actually be the general manager.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's a good example. I bet we all, if we like really think about it, how I have really good examples like that.
Examples every day. Yep, absolutely.
The participants listening right now, can you go into the chat and think of a time when you've noticed your own unconscious bias? Maybe you can tell us a quick story like Cheryl just did in the chat, or if it's happened to you and it came out as something that you noticed. Dr. Rowley, you sent me a couple of slides, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about unconscious bias as it relates to race, because it's so timely with everything that's going into that plays into our world today. I'm going to just share your slides here, and then you let me know which one. I have one that I think
probably the second one, because the first one
right?
we've talked about a lot already.
Yeah. Is it this one?
Mm-hmm.
Talk us through this graphic a little bit.
Sure. This comes from the National Equity Project, and I was looking for a graphic that would try to connect the institutional to what we think of more as how the brain works. And what's really important is that explicit bias, if you want to think of it that way, explicit and implicit bias are completely connected. So in this chart, what the authors were trying to do, and I did, and you're welcome to share in these resources, I did link the article as well. It's called "Don't Talk About Implicit Bias Without Talking About Structural Racism." What they were trying to do is show the ways that how we learn to think, this process of shortcuts, of working through assumptions, or those relationships that were like, they talked about in the video, if you say peanut butter, somebody else says jelly, right? That process of the premises that we've already been given, that those then are interconnected with all the structures that are around us, our history, our policies, our practices, and that because of how we have over years and years and years sought to have maybe levels of unequal power in our society, in the policies support that, and then the practices that we use support that as well. But what is happening on a regular, every moment basis is that we're seeing these structures and policies as normal. We're seeing them as, of course, that's how it should be, because so-and-so is that way. So in this article, I really appreciated when they put this chart together, making those connections to the structural racism, and I'd love to hear what our other panelists have to say about that as well.
Let me come back to the panelists. I actually found another really brief video that I think speaks to structural racism in education. This one hit kind of close to home for me, because I feel like my son went through this a little bit in school, and I switched schools because of it. So I'll show the video, and then I'll tell you what my thoughts were about the experience that I had with my son, and then we'll come back to the panelists and get your reaction. So this speaks more from the individual interactions to when it becomes part of a system, particularly for little kids. Oh, let me make sure I got the sound on here. I keep forgetting to click. There we go. Here we go.
Hi, Mom, it's me. I got in trouble again at school today.
Hi, this is Miss Jones again. I'm finding your son very disruptive in class, more so than other students.
I feel like the teacher doesn't like me. Other kids do bad things, but they don't get in trouble.
He's defiant and shows a real lack of respect for any structure or authority.
I hate school because the teachers are always mean to me and I don't feel like I'm learning anything.
I'm really concerned about his behavior.
I'm always getting in trouble for what I didn't do.
We're going to have to adopt a zero-tolerance policy, young man.
School keeps calling my mother, and she gets really, really mad at me.
What is going on? You better explain
I feel like
yourself.
the whole world is turned up against me. It doesn't like me anymore. There are days I get up and I just decide I'm not going to school.
And we go to the park, like everybody's always telling me I'm not worth anything, so what's the point of trying?
I know the cops are watching us, but we just hope we don't get caught.
Your son's absences are a problem. They will definitely affect his grade point average.
I don't feel safe in my class anymore.
Should I assume you're unprepared again today?
I would always eventually get picked on by the teacher. He makes examples of me.
I feel really singled out, and I just try to avoid people because every time I look, somebody's always talking about me. Oh, she's always getting in trouble.
But I started fighting more because nobody wants to hang out around a troublemaker. The only time I have real friends is when I'm on the block. So that's where I'll stay.
I'm sure you understand we take our discipline policies very seriously here at the school. What are we going to do about your son?
So there's a lot of different stats, and after the conversation, I'll send I compiled some of them for a different project that I did around the way that Black and brown kids are treated in school as opposed to white kids. And this came really close to home for me because my son was probably the same age as the kid in this video. And he was doing fine in school. And then when he hit second grade, he had a different teacher. And all of a sudden it was like every day he was in trouble, every day. And they would call me and say that he kicked over a desk or that he ran out of class or like just really extreme things. And I'm like, who is this kid? Like, I just don't recognize any of this in him. And I'm like, he never acts like this at home. And I mean, he was always the top of his class in math and, you know, just pretty smart. He would get bored. He's a little smart aleck, you know. I could see how he could be a little annoying to a teacher, but it was like he was getting in trouble every day and I just could not understand it. So I'm talking to him at home and he said to me, I feel like my teacher doesn't care about me. And then he started crying. And I'm like, what is going on here? And through a lot of different conversations and I feel like he had just been labeled and he was the bad kid and that was just it. So the fact that he was like the #1 kid in math and maybe he's bored and maybe, you know, that never would come up in the conversations. How he was excelling would never come up in the conversation. They would mention he likes to play basketball and he's really disruptive. And I just felt like, okay, I got to get him out of here. We switched the school and the next year, no problems. I mean, not no problems. I mean, the smart aleck thing would come up. The teacher would be like, yeah, I can see he talks too much, but nothing like, never, terrible reports from the teachers. He's excelling. He's doing fine. The new teacher's like, he's doing the same thing all the other little boys do. You know, it was just a completely different conversation and experience. And he would actually be happy going to school. And I think about the fact that I had the option to switch his school and that I was conscious enough to like see what was going on. And if I hadn't made that switch and I let him stay there, all I could think is that whatever we just saw in that video would have been something that would have happened to him like it happens to so many other kids, not because he didn't have potential, but because he just got caught up in this system where he was just sort of labeled as something. Maisi, does that resonate? Is that something that you
So much so. And I certainly appreciate what you're sharing, just from your own personal experience, and that clip was certainly powerful. I think about also what Dr. Worley mentioned about, you know, what we expect is to be normal, right? I think that's the thing, is that really struck me when you said that, Dr. Worley, when you said, you know, it's what we tend to think should be normal, should be, in other words, acceptable, you know, the way things should be. And so it's not unconscious. It's not, when we say unconscious, we're not talking about just, you know, not realizing that we're saying something or noticing something, but not realizing that that's actually a bias. you know, and thinking that with that, what just happened, it should be normal, or what we see should be normal, and therefore it's not a bias. So that seems to be the issue, right? With that, when we're going to say unconscious, it's not that we're not aware. We are aware. We're just not aware that we're being biased. We just assume it's normal. So yes, going back to what you had asked, Corey Jo, about have I seen it? Oh, absolutely. I'm going to go back to the point I made earlier. You know, it's like watching a television show. You know, every time I hear a certain word or something happen, then I'm triggered, right? I see, oh, well, oh yeah, he's the troublemaker. There he goes again. But you know what? I don't notice anything else that's happening. The behavior is different for other kids. In fact, we find that girls, research, you know, has indicated over and over again that girls misbehave just as much. They just misbehave in a different kind of way, right? So they're not going to make loud noises. They might pull each other's hair, give each other the evil eye, or whatever it might be, you know, and disrupt the learning of others and themselves. But they don't behave that way. And as a teacher, then we tend to only see, you know, that behavior that we assume is bad, right? And that isn't normal. It shouldn't be happening. I hear things like, look at me in the eyes, right? That's respectful. Look at me in the eyes. That should be normal in my mind, right? That's my bias, although I may not even think it's a bias. So if some kid is not looking at me in the eye, my bias might be that they should, and if they're not, then they're being rebellious, right? They're not complying. And then, of course, then they get in trouble. The child may have no idea what it is that they did that was wrong, you know, and then get in trouble for it. So then what happens? You know, this is kind of, I digress a little bit, but, you know, then they don't know what the appropriate behavior is. Because, you know, that's what they grew up learning to do, and understanding is that if I don't look at someone in the eye, then that's actually respectful in many cultures. If I look at someone in the eyes, that's actually disrespectful, you know, and then of course, there are those teachers who might be biased and not even realize that's not normal behavior for everyone.
Cheryl, there was another video that I found, and I'll share it in the email, the follow-up email, because we won't have time to look at it, but it was about unconscious bias in the workplace and how it shows up in recruiting or promotions, and how sometimes people who are in the position to promote folks will promote people who are most like them or who they assume are going to, you know, be able to excel, or they won't promote the woman that just had a baby because, oh, she can't handle all the travel, I won't even bother with, you know. What are some of the examples or ways that this kind of unconscious bias shows up in the systems at work?
Everything you just said.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's because people who have a seat at the table are not inviting other people who don't look like them to have a seat at the table. And so we talk about diversity, but we also need to talk about inclusion. And diversity is about being asked to the party, but inclusion is about being asked to dance. So I may be in the organization, but if I'm not asked to dance, meaning I'm not assigned a mentor, meaning that I'm not given projects that I may not have been given otherwise. If I'm not, you know, kind of pushed out of my comfort zone to see what I can do, if somebody doesn't believe in me in the organization because I don't look like them, then that creates a problem, and that just perpetuates this systemic problem. And it's difficult for people of color, it's difficult for women, and then you add women of color, woo, you know, that ceiling, but also for men of color, because our Black men and brown men are perceived as being, you know, they can't handle it. They're going to, you know, be that angry Black man or angry, you know, Latinx man. And, you know, we won't be able to understand them because they're so mad about things. And other people can express their frustration, but it's seen as being assertive versus being seen as aggressive. So I think until we start to change some language, until we start to get people to invite other people to dance, this the cycle is going to continue until somebody puts the brakes on and says, you know what, we need to do something different. That's something that we're trying to do here at MRA. It's like, it has to start with recruiting, but just because you get them in the door doesn't mean that they're going to stay, because if they start to look around and go, there's nobody else that looks like me at the table, why do I want to be here? Then recruiting is only one piece of it. The inclusion is the other piece. How do I get to be heard? And how can I help, be moved up the ladder just like other people? And what systems does the organization already have in place for succession planning? And then is that offered to everyone? So, but it starts at the top.
Yeah, the YMCA had a national Unlearning Racism conference yesterday, and I got a chance to watch a little part of it. There's a pastor and an author who authored 2 best-selling books, and I can't remember his name right now, but I will share the books. And it's a white man who is like all in people's business about this unconscious bias thing, and he brought up something that was really important, that a lot of times the unconscious bias, particularly for Black and brown men, is tied to something violent or scary. It's not just that they're not as good as, or they're stupid, or they're late. No, it's that they're scary and they're criminals and they're going to hurt you. And that kind of plays into the idea that, they're being brutalized a little bit more, not a little bit, 2.5 times more than a white man would, because it's a Black man, and being called out in school more because Black boys are bad, and some idea that there's like this latent fear that is really attached to the associations that we see in media. Dr. Rowley, can you talk a little bit about the role of media in this? We can think of all the television shows and TV. I mean, the news stories. I mean, how does that show up in our world?
Wow, I don't know if I'm the right person for that, because I try to avoid mainstream media, but I think of it also maybe as a parent. And I wanted to, first of all, I'm still in recovery from that last video you showed, because like you, I've been through that with one of my children. And of course it was my child that was male and Black that had that kind of situation, and I think about maybe it's not, so if we've talked about race, we've talked about age a little bit, gender certainly comes into this, and well, we watch a lot of TV. I mean, the commercials get louder. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. You could try that experiment. They get louder. They call us back to the television, right? There's been a lot of studies on that. The roles that people take, people want to see themselves. So the shows that are really popular are the ones where people are living stereotypes. I mean, think about the shows that, before reality TV took on. But those are actually all really made up characters too. When you think about it, they call it reality TV, but they choose people to be on those shows that are kind of like the ultimate version of the stereotype of that person, right? So we see that, we want to see that, we want to see ourselves there, and it just reinforces the cycle. When my son hit, I think it was like by 2nd grade, but definitely by 3rd grade, when he got emotional about something, he was actually told he wasn't allowed to cry in school. So what is a boy supposed to do, right? Throw something or get angry. I mean, we all need to do something sometimes. And so he was literally told, not just by the teacher, but with all the other kids in the class. So he came home and said, "Mom, why can't boys cry? I don't get it. Why is that a problem?" So I'll just throw that out as an example. It's not only do we see it in the media, but it's like totally reinforced. My oldest wanted pink flip-flops, right? So, he wore those. And what do you think happened? People were shocked by it, right? And he absorbs that and he sees that. And so we just sort of think about that. If we're going to interrupt it, as Cheryl, I think, was starting to talk about, which I think is such an important piece of this, we're going to need to be able to notice these things going on, and begin to tell ourselves, this is a story that's happening. This is what's going on. And we need to see it as like back up from like the macro view and say, oh, what I'm watching right now is really just a stereotype of that situation. And I know it's a stereotype, and I'm not going to live my life with that stereotype as real information.
So we're gonna go, some of the panelists all know, but the participants don't know that my colleague Marjorie Yoshida has been in the chat hanging out with y'all so she can bring questions to us. So Marjorie, after I ask this question, I just want you to kind of get prepped and tell us what you've been seeing in the chat and if there's anything that we should discuss before we close out here. My next question, yeah, go ahead.
Move on. Talking about media and advertisement, it just reminded me, I don't know how many people have seen this commercial, Procter and Gamble, but it's a black man.
I'm gonna show it at the end. I'll show it at the end.
Never mind.
I know exactly what you're talking about, but you can give them the gist of it, but I'll show it's like a 2 minute.
I'll stop talking.
Yeah, okay. So I'll go with this. The big question that everybody has on their mind is, you know, we started off saying the good thing is that once you know you're doing this, you can stop it. How do you stop it? What are the steps that folks need to take to kind of reverse it? And as you're preparing your answers, I'll just show you what I found online. I'm always finding something. But I thought that this was an interesting, the self steps, and there's a bunch of different ways and steps that people have out there. But can you guys sort of speak to what do you do once you know about this to stop yourself from doing it, especially if it's problematic?
Well, I'll start. I think and I think I put this in the chat too. It really starts with communication. It starts with an open and honest dialogue. When we don't know stuff, we make it up. And so rather than making it up, let's find out some facts. And who better to get it from than the people who are living it? One of my colleagues and I had a discussion the other day, and we were talking about the difference between social unrest and riots. And when white people use the term riot, that's not what this protest was all about. It was it wasn't a riot. That's not, and so when you assign negative connotations to the situation that's happening without understanding the entire situation, that's when it perpetuates these unconscious bias and reinforces the thoughts and the expectations that people have. And so I think it really boils down to, we just need to be open. We need to be honest with each other. When he and I actually had a conversation about Black Lives Matter, and and let's be honest, a lot of white people will say, well, all lives matter. Yes, they do. However, these situations are not happening to the other ethnic groups. They're not happening to other races. They're happening to Black people. And so let's just call it what it is. This is what we need to focus on right now. And I saw something on Facebook the other day and it said, when Boston Marathon had their, the bombings there, and they came back Boston strong, they didn't say everything, United States strong. And so all of those pieces, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we really need to focus on that and really find out, what does that really mean, and how does that make you feel? So when he and I had conversations around George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks down in Atlanta, all of these things, he's like, I was not aware of that. You have helped me understand it from a different perspective. And I think that's our goal, is to help people understand it from different perspectives.
Yep. Maisie, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say two thoughts. A healthy dose of humility is not a bad thing. I think it's always good to, when we catch ourselves or someone catches it for us, it's okay. A little humility is not a bad thing. To sit with it, to reflect, and then make a very intentional effort not to perpetuate the stereotype or the bias, because people are always watching. When it comes to schools, other children are always watching. They're always learning. That's how they learn these biases, by watching the rest of us in the world. So I want to add those 2 points in there.
Marjorie, what are you seeing in the chat room that you think we should talk about?
Well, I think one big question is, how do we try to move our workplace organizations to make change? There's a lot of need for education, and what are some of the strategies to implement? I think Cheryl touched on a part of this by saying it's got to come from the top. But what do we need the top to buy into?
Yeah, I saw somebody else said that folks that probably would need the training wouldn't sign up for it. So how do you incorporate that? Dr. Worley, were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, in fact, there's research that shows that forcing someone to take training actually can backfire. So I spent a lot of years doing a lot of training and trying to, as you know, a lot of teaching. And my last few years have been much more about trying to impact structure. And if we go back to the comment earlier about normal, it's really about recrafting what is normal. So all the way through the organization, you've got to do an analysis of, what is feeding this? What are the habits, the rules, the regulations, the expectations? And from the top all the way down the bottom and then back up, you pull that apart and you put in measurable metrics that will help you change to where you want to be. It's a big process, but individual people are working on it, but the reality is you're always going to be working on it. So if there aren't some levers of change to help you switch up and catch you, as Vicey said, to pull out that moment of humility, then it's easier just to revert back to that path, the easy path to travel, which is to please the company, how the company is set up. So it's really a large structural change that has to happen.
I'll also say, as a leader in my...
No, go ahead, Dr. Worley. I'll ask you afterwards about that research. Somebody's asking for links to whatever we might have. Micey, go ahead.
I was going to say, as a leader in an organization, I encourage the conversations. I encourage open discussions about this, and that I always say, just as long as it's healthy to talk. It's as long as we're not attacking people, but we're sharing ideas and learning from one another. That's important as far as leadership goes.
Cheryl, I know. I mean, I can imagine the resistance that you sometimes see in people that, to Dr. Worley's point, are like mandated to be in a training. But do you feel like people are mostly open to this, or what are the struggles that people have when we're trying to teach them to unlearn something that maybe they don't want to address?
Yeah, I think it really boils down to creating that open and honest environment where people feel comfortable in sharing. And we have to meet people where they are. Some people are ready to talk about it and other people are not. And so giving them the tools that they need to meet where they are, and then, okay, when you're ready, then we're going to make it incremental. There is, of course, a lot of requests for diversity, inclusion, unconscious bias now, because it's top of mind for a lot of organizations. And we always say, if people are not talking about it, they're not telling you in HR, they're still talking about it. So how do you have those open and honest dialogues and conversations, and creating that safe space where people feel comfortable, not mandating it, but if you do mandate it, then it has to be mandated for everybody. And then actually when people actually start to get in there and start to talk, then it's not as bad as they thought it was going to be. And so just creating that environment where people, as Micey was saying, don't feel attacked, they just feel like they can share.
Well, I'm so grateful for all of you sharing and being a part of this conversation, and all of the participants. When we first started having these conversations, I didn't know how long we would be able to do them. I wasn't sure if people would, say, oh, okay, Corey, get off of this and let's go back to talking about what's great about Milwaukee, which is really the bulk of what Fuel does, professional development, brands in Milwaukee, more positive messages. Not that this isn't positive, but the conversations are a little more difficult around race and racism, and it's a slight departure to our broad programming. But by and large, I've been seeing that people want to continue to communicate about it, and folks want a place to talk about it and kind of think through it. So for the participants, if this is something, if communication has been helpful for you, if this has been a vehicle to help you understand and express yourself, let us know in the chat if you want us to keep these going, and if there are other topics that you'd like us to talk about. Marjorie Yoshida, my colleague in the background, she's like the voice of reason. We don't see her on screen, but she's ever present in the chat and checking out what we're all talking about. Marjorie, thank you so much for your help today. I know she's so busy, she got another appointment. She has another place where she has to be the voice of reason. So Marjorie, thank you so much for your help. I really appreciate you. Appreciate all of the panels. Micey, it was great connecting with you. Cheryl, good to see you as always.
You too.
And Dr. Worley, you're just still out here changing lives. I mean, you're just doing it, right? So this is the period of time where I always show a video towards the end. And the video that Cheryl mentioned was the one that I was going to show. This PNG has a lot of great videos and a whole program around this that MMAC is partnered with them on. So I'm going to show that. So as I'm doing that and you're watching the video, go in the chat and leave a love note for our panelists. Tell them how great they are. If there's any resources or anything that you want us to get from them and share in the follow-up email, please let us know that. And if you have any other questions or topics or anything that you want us to touch on, now would be the time to share that in the chat. So let me go to this video. It's a good one because Cheryl recommended it.
Oh, yeah.
Let's talk about it so we can see beyond it. Wasn't that great? All the Black people cheered, yay! I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, we've all seen the look, and that's a very insightful video. I hope it was helpful to all of you who are still watching with us. And thank you again to all the panelists. Okay. Remember, webinar days for Fuel Milwaukee are Tuesdays and Thursdays from 2 to 3 p.m. The announcements of the topics come pretty close to the actual day of the conversation, but make sure you pencil us in if you know that you've been wanting to be a part of these conversations. And if the topic is something that is appealing to you, then you just hop on and register as soon as you get the registration link, okay? Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Trust in all the panelists, the chat, so you can see all your little love notes. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Great to talk with everyone.
Thank you.
Chat's coming through. I see it. I'll wait for you to get your chats in.
Thank you again, Corey Joe.
Yeah, thanks for a great conversation.
It was a great conversation.
We gotta all hang out in person once we get a vaccine here.
Yes. Absolutely.
I mean, we could do it with a mask, but it won't be as much fun. Robin says she's coming. Robin, what city are you in? You keep saying, I want to say you're in Cincinnati, but I don't feel it. I don't know if that's right. Cleveland. So you just hop on in the car once we get a vaccine, and we'll all go to happy hour together.
Yeah, we didn't even get to talk about masks and all the facial expression issues and bias that comes with that when we see people.
God.
Yeah.
Another whole area of conversation that takes us into a new realm.
Yep.
Dr. Worley,
So much.
could you talk more about the film The Talk?
Oh, so the film The Talk was, I'm pretty sure it's the same filmmaker who then did that short. And it looks at what Black and brown parents talk about with their children to prepare them to navigate through white-dominated society. And as a person of white, I found it really helpful to see that, that really sort of live film perspective, really, really hard scenarios, but also to think about how that gets filled out in parenting. So yeah, it was I think the filmmaker has an incredible way of making very sharp points in a very visual and good, thoughtful way.
Mm-hmm. All right, so as there's a couple more people leaving the chat, and I'll say this, I couldn't find the tape because it's so hard to find clips of Oprah on YouTube. Like her team is gangster. They like take it down right away. They don't play that, right? Copyright stuff. But when I was working at the Black Holocaust Museum, and this had to be, I think it was 2005, it was either 05 or 06, the Oprah Winfrey show reached out to us. They were doing a show on Prejudice, and they were exploring unconscious bias, overt racism, just all kinds of stuff. And they were going to have a bunch of people come in and take the implicit bias test out of Harvard. Mm-hmm. And the professor that created the test was there on the show, and they asked us to come and be on the show and take the test. So it was me, my then husband, and my colleague, Bethany Chris, who also worked at the museum with us, and we all went to the Oprah show. We took the test. We sat like on the front row and they recorded us after we took the test. And I was so nervous taking this test. I'm like, I better come back neutral, because if I come back with a bias either way, how am I going to explain that? And I'm running this museum. I was so scared to take this test. So all of us took it. I came back neutral. My ex came back with a bias toward African Americans, and I think Bethany came back with a bias towards African Americans. And she had studied like Africology and at Northwestern, and my ex grew up in a very affluent Black neighborhood just outside of Chicago, so it really made sense. Mm-hmm. So they had us sit in front of this test. Sit in front of the computer, and the test popped up, and you just had to quick respond. And they came through and asked us about our responses and how we felt. And I remember I was like, oh my God, I'm just so nervous. And they put that on the show. Like, that was actually on the Oprah show.
You never know what part.
I wish I could find it. But what I thought was interesting about the show, and we didn't have time to talk about it, is that there were a lot of Black people that took the test that had a bias against Black people.
Oh, yes.
Which, I think we kind of know that like media seeps into everybody's consciousness, but a lot of people were shocked. I think I was shocked by how many of them were like, I'm super afraid of Black people, or like, every time I see a Black man, I clutch my purse too, and maybe without even knowing it until they had taken the test. But it was very, very interesting. Mm-hmm. There was an interracial couple on there where they both had a bias toward the opposite race, so that like made sense why they would link up. Mm-hmm. It was just super interesting. What do you do? Have you ever taken one of the tests? What do you think about them? Because I know they're somewhat controversial.
I've taken them. I think they make sense. Mm-hmm. When I did a all staff meeting here at MRA, and I suggested that people take it, one of my colleagues actually did. And then he sent me his results, and he said, I thought I was more neutral than I am. And so I have some work to do.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say I've taken it, and I also have read a lot of the skeptical, debates and and thinking about it. But what you just described, Cheryl, is one of the pieces that it really does seem to have the ability to get conversations started. Even if it's not, in many ways, it fails as a measure, particularly of who you don't like. It's more able to measure what you feel comfortable towards than is able to measure what you are uncomfortable with, which is really interesting. And we've now got over a decade of studies looking at it and testing it. And I think that I did have on my resources list the book that was written by the test creators, looking at that process. So looking at what they've learned over 10 years. But there are some weaknesses to it because it isn't very valid or reliable in some ways. And so what the biggest issue, it's like the problem with ACEs testing, one where they look at children who've had adverse childhood experiences, is the implicit bias test is used too much and in not maybe the best ways from a scientific standard, but it definitely gets conversations started. And it's an approachable way in, because it's been so popularized. It's kind of like made the New York Times bestseller list or whatever. So it feels okay to take it, and it gives you a chance to talk then about.
Yeah, I would agree with what you both said, and and I like what's in the chat there by Sarah. Even if it's not wrong, even if they are wrong, it's a point of discussion, and that's the value. As long as we understand it, I think that's important.
I think if we do, we Radio Milwaukee is coming on as a media sponsor for these conversations. We're going to brand them as our Fuels Race Bridge conversation, and Self-Help Credit Union came on as our first sponsor. So we have a sponsor starting next week, so we'll keep them going. And if we end up doing a part 2 of this, I think I'm going to encourage everybody to take the test so that we could talk about it, like what it felt like and what the responses were. And I think it'd be a good next step to this conversation.
It can also be, it's been suggested to take it more than once and to take it on different days and in different situations. That's when you kind of start to dig into some of what we talked about today, which is, if someone was just really, really cranky with you or you had a certain experience, you might not test quite the same way as, or that day you were at Oprah, you were really, not to say that you can fix the test, but the reality is you can do that sort of big picture looking down and how am I going to approach this? And you can a little bit here and there change your score given.
Because I was not relaxed taking it at all. I was like,
but you really wanted to be neutral, so that you were really focused on that, and it probably helped you to be. You might have been anyway, but you probably did help you go in that direction because your brain was, hyper conscious of that.
And it was interesting because I'm like growing up in Milwaukee, so Milwaukee is really segregated. I've gone to mostly white schools, and I remember having a little bit of shame when I was a kid that I would like change my voice so I could sound more white, or I would hide certain things about my culture, and I wondered if that was gonna come up, and without context, like, does it not make sense, and how is it, but I would have been more comfortable with the bias if it said I had a bias toward, like, if I was neutral, that's cool. If I had a bias for Black people, okay, that makes more sense. But if it had come back, like there was a woman there that was kind of embarrassed that hers came, a Black woman that came, it said that she had a bias against Black people. But once she started to really think about it, it embarrassed her. But she's like, this happened to me when I was a kid. And, once she started thinking through it, it wasn't as painful for her. But I think that initial thought of like, what are people going to think of me if this comes back, as whatever. But what I like about the test is that they have different ones. So it's not just for race. It's like all different, all different things that you can kind of explore. So maybe we'll get people to go in there and do that and then come on and talk about it.
Yeah. Ooh, there's just so much more to say. Can we do a part 2 or something?
We gotta do a part 2.
Yeah, I saw that a couple of different times. But Carrie Jo, when you get ready to do that one, can you invite me?
Yes. Yeah. I will for sure. Okay, I see our chat. We're still getting, but like as we're talking, people are like saying
the outtakes, the inside story.
The outtakes. There's the comment, Marie. You know what I think with the Fuel event. So when we do our leadership luncheons in person, they are 60-minute luncheons, but we learned pretty soon that it was just 60 minutes was just, for some people, they had to be out right at 60 minutes. Like the really young professionals early in career, I got to get back to the office, which is why we kept it at 60 minutes. But we would do a hard stop at 60 minutes and include some of the Q&A. We would do a hard stop, and if people had to leave, they had to leave. And then we would like extend it. So it was kind of scheduled. People would know that the extended portion was scheduled, and it was kind of optional if you can make it. And I think we might have to start doing that because we kind of informally do it anyway.
Party.
So formalize the informal.
Yeah, let's formalize the after party for folks. So we'll do a hard stop at an hour, and people that can stay on. We did this one time, and it went over like 40 minutes, and more than half of the people stayed on the call. And because I had two speakers, and they were rogue speakers. I mean, they just took over the conversation. I just like, forget it, just. But it was good. It was like, it's so good, and people really are needing to connect with each other. So I get it. We'll formalize the informal.
Okay.
We'll formalize it.
I love the videos too. I thought the videos were great.
They were great.
I love YouTube. I mean, you can find anything. It's finding ones that are short are hard.
Right.
And there are some that are like kind of corny. Some of them are, I mean, I get that it's kind of hard to like sum up some of these scenarios in a short period of time, but a lot of short HR videos do tend to be like over the top and a little bit corny, which I think is kind of funny. But I thought we found some good ones today.
You did a great job.
Absolutely.
Really good.
I learned a lot from you guys too.
Well, learned a lot from all of you. These are always great conversations, necessary conversations to have.
I love you guys. Thanks so much.
Encourage you.
Thank you.
You should really consider going back to school.
I know. I have to. I can't stop thinking about it. I think about it once a day.
I'm in school, so that's why I say, well, don't make me suffer by myself.
What are you studying now?
I am at Garrett Theological Seminary down in Evanston, Illinois. So I'm working my master's in pastoral care and counseling.
So is everything online, or are you going down there sometimes?
Last semester before COVID hit, I was going down there, but this fall semester, everything will be online. So, yeah.
Nice. All right, Dr. Worley, we'll talk about it because I know I got to do it. I can't stop thinking about it. I know I have to do it. So.
Well, I'll be a great listener, and you can come, and it doesn't matter what program it is. We'll talk it through and figure out what's right for you.
Okay.
Sounds like just a matter of time.
It is. It's just, I mean, and now it's like you might as well do it now, right? Since you're at home.
There you go.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Doing awesome work.
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, go to school.
I gotta get that master's. I gotta do it.
Yeah.
Maybe PhD.
You go. I have a master's in adult education. So when I get ready to go back to work on this, my pastor said, "Why are you going for another master's? You should be working on your PhD." I'm like, nah.
You don't want to do it?
Because at least this one is, I'm on the clinical track. So I'll have, once I complete, then I'll have my license to do pastoral care and counseling. So Christian counseling.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when it's time for me to do my PhD, I'll come and get. I'm like, come on, you got to get yours too. Come on.
Girl, bye.
Dr. Lucas DeBerry, what do you mean?
Girl, bye. No, it's gonna take me 3 years to get this other master's.
Really?
I've been working on 1.5 years.
Oh wow.
It's intense. And like I got to do all these clinical hours. And so that's the big issue. But then once I complete it, I'll have my license to practice. So not independently practice, but I can work in, hospitals or.
Oh yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, you would be that would be great because you have such a warm, comforting personality and disposition. Like it would probably be really easy to open up to you.
People do open up to me. So that's just, it's just weird. People tell me their entire life story. So
yeah, it's just meant to be.
It is. But yeah, you work on your master's first, and then I will support you in the PhD.
Okay, let's get this step first get this out the way first. I got it. All right, take care. I'll see you later.
Okay.
You go study.
I'm out for the summer. Hallelujah.
Oh, good.
Okay. See you later.
Bye-bye. Attendees, we got 11 of you. Y'all get back to work. Why are you still here? Bye, guys.